The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Kensington Palace as Detective Sergeant Marcus Webb adjusted his collar and checked his watch. He had been assigned to the Royal Protection Detail for nearly 8 years, but today felt different. Something in the air seemed unusually tense, though he couldn't quite place why. The usual morning routine proceeded like clockwork around him. Gardeners tending to the immaculate rose beds, palace staff moving quietly through their duties, and the changing of the guard happening with military precision. Prince George, now 16 years old, had developed a reputation among the security staff as being unusually observant for someone his age. Unlike many teenagers who remained absorbed in their phones and social circles, George showed a genuine curiosity about how things worked around the palace. He often asked questions that surprised the staff, questions that revealed a sharp mind and an analytical nature that reminded Marcus of the late Queen Elizabeth in her youth. The prince had a particular interest in history and architecture, which meant he spent considerable time exploring the older sections of the palace that most family members rarely visited. That Tuesday morning, George had requested permission to access the East Wing Library, a dusty collection of historical documents and old ledgers that dated back centuries. The request itself wasn't unusual. The prince had been researching his family history for a school project and had received approval weeks earlier. What Marcus found peculiar was the timing. George had been to the library almost every day for the past 2 weeks, staying longer each time, and returning with an expression that Marcus could only describe as troubled. Marcus had served in the Metropolitan Police for 15 years before joining the Royal Protection Service. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts told him something was brewing beneath the surface of palace life. He had noticed small changes in the prince's behavior. George had become quieter during meals, more withdrawn during public appearances, and had started asking his tutors unusual questions about legal procedures and governmental oversight. The library occupied 3 large rooms on the 2nd floor of the East Wing, a section of the palace that had been partially closed for renovations 2 years ago and never fully reopened. The official reason given was budget constraints, but Marcus had always found that explanation suspicious given the royal family's resources. The area had a forgotten quality to it, with sheets covering furniture and portraits, and a musty smell that spoke of long neglect. Only a handful of staff members had keys to this section, and visitor logs showed that before George's recent interest, no one had accessed it in over 18 months. On this particular morning, Marcus accompanied George to the library as protocol required. The prince carried a leather notebook and wore an expression of determination that made him look older than his years. As they walked through the quiet corridors, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors, George suddenly stopped and turned to Marcus. "Detective Sergeant Webb, can I ask you something in confidence?" The prince's voice was steady, but Marcus detected an underlying nervousness. Marcus considered his response carefully. His duty was to protect the royal family, but he also believed in honesty. "Your Royal Highness, I'm here to keep you safe. If something's troubling you, I'd like to help, but I also have obligations to report certain matters to my superiors." George nodded, seeming to expect this answer. "Fair enough. I just wanted to know if you discovered something wrong, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden, what would you do?" The question hung in the air between them. Marcus studied the young prince's face, seeing genuine concern there. "I'd follow the evidence and do what's right, regardless of who it might upset. And that's what the law requires." Something shifted in George's expression, relief perhaps, or the confirmation of a decision already made. "Good. I think I might need your help soon. But first, I need to be absolutely certain about something." They continued to the library, and Marcus unlocked the heavy oak door. George entered and went straight to a section in the far corner, pulling out several leather-bound ledgers with practiced efficiency. This wasn't random browsing. The prince knew exactly what he was looking for. Marcus positioned himself near the entrance, maintaining his professional distance while keeping George in his peripheral vision. For the next 2 hours, George worked methodically through documents, occasionally making notes in his notebook. Marcus noticed the prince's hands trembling slightly as he turned certain pages, and once, George's face went pale as he read something that clearly shocked him. Whatever the prince was uncovering, it was having a profound effect on him. Around mid-morning, footsteps approached from the corridor. Marcus tensed, his hand instinctively moving closer to his radio. Sir Edmund Hartford, the Lord Chamberlain and one of the most senior members of the royal household staff, appeared in the doorway. He was a tall man in his late 60s, with silver hair and the kind of aristocratic bearing that came from generations of privilege. He had served the royal family for over 30 years and wielded considerable influence behind the scenes. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Edmund said with a slight bow, though his tone carried an edge. "I wasn't informed you'd be spending time here again today. Your studies with Professor Whitmore are scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. George looked up from the ledger he'd been examining, and Marcus noticed the prince carefully placed his hand over the page, as if hiding its contents. "I asked Professor Whitmore to reschedule. This research is important for my history project." Sir Edmund's eyes narrowed slightly. He stepped further into the room, his gaze sweeping over the scattered documents. "I see. And what aspect of history requires such intensive study of old household accounts? Surely the main library has more suitable resources for academic work." "I'm researching the administrative history of the palace," George replied, his voice calm but firm. "How the household was managed during different periods. It's fascinating, actually. Did you know there are records here going back to the 1700s? "Yes, I'm aware of our historical archives," Sir Edmund said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Though I must say, I'm surprised such dry material would captivate someone your age. Perhaps you'd benefit from more engaging primary sources. I'd be happy to arrange access to more interesting collections." Marcus watched this exchange carefully. On the surface, it seemed like a senior staff member showing concern for a young royal's education. But there was something else happening here, a subtle battle of wills. Sir Edmund wanted to know what George was looking at, and George was determined not to reveal it. "Thank you, Sir Edmund, but I'm quite satisfied with what I've found here," George said, closing the ledger and standing. I'll take this with me to review later." "I'm afraid that's not possible, Your Royal Highness," Sir Edmund said quickly. "These historical documents are fragile and must remain in the library for preservation purposes. If you need specific information, I can arrange for copies to be made by our archival staff." George's jaw tightened. "I see. Then I'll simply have to spend more time here reading them. I'll inform Professor Whitmore I'll need to reschedule for the rest of the week." The tension in the room thickened. Marcus could see Sir Edmund calculating his next move. The Lord Chamberlain couldn't directly forbid a member of the royal family from accessing palace archives without raising questions, but he clearly didn't want George digging through these particular records. "Perhaps we should discuss this with your father," Sir Edmund suggested. "The Prince of Wales might have thoughts on how you're spending your study time." "That's an excellent idea," George replied with unexpected enthusiasm. "I'd very much like to discuss my findings with him. Shall we arrange a meeting?" Sir Edmund's expression flickered with something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Concern, perhaps, or calculation. "I'll speak with his private secretary about scheduling. In the meantime, I really must insist you attend your tutorial. Education consistency is important." After a moment's hesitation, George nodded. "Of course. Detective Sergeant Webb, shall we?" As they left the library, Marcus noticed Sir Edmund remained behind, and through the partially open door, that he saw the Lord Chamberlain moving toward the section where George had been working. The prince noticed too, glancing back with a troubled expression. They walked in silence for several minutes before George spoke quietly. "He's going to move or destroy them." "The documents?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice low. "The ledgers that show the payments. I should have taken photographs, but I didn't think anyone knew I was onto something." George's frustration was evident. "I was stupid." Marcus made a decision that could potentially end his career. "What exactly did you find?" George stopped walking and looked around to ensure they were alone in the corridor. "Payments. Large regular payments going back decades to various individuals and organizations. But they're not listed in any official household accounts. It's like a completely separate financial system running parallel to the legitimate one." "Money laundering?" Marcus suggested. "Maybe, or bribes, or both." George pulled out his notebook. "I started noticing discrepancies when I was researching how the household budget changed over time. Certain years showed expenses that didn't match up with official records. So I dug deeper, found references to these ledgers in some old staff meeting minutes, and tracked them down. The payments are coded, but some of the names I managed to decode are very prominent people, politicians, business leaders, even some foreign officials." Marcus felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. If what George was describing was real, this was far beyond his pay grade. "Your Royal Highness, this is serious. If these records show illegal activity—" "That's just it," George interrupted. "I don't know if it's illegal or just deeply unethical. Some of the payments might be legitimate but hidden for security reasons. But others, especially the ones to political figures around the times of major policy decisions affecting the crown, those look very suspicious. And there's something else." "What?" "My grandfather's name appears repeatedly in the margins of entries from the 1990s and early 2000s, before he was king. It looks like he might have known about this, maybe even authorized some of it." Marcus understood now why George looked so troubled. This wasn't just about uncovering financial irregularities. It potentially implicated members of the prince's own family in serious misconduct. The weight of that discovery would be crushing for anyone, let alone a 16-year-old. "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked. "I don't know," George admitted, and for the first time he sounded like the teenager he was. "If I'm wrong, I'll have damaged relationships with people I care about and created a scandal for nothing. If I'm right, exposing this could hurt the monarchy at a time when public support is already fragile. But if I do nothing and this is real corruption, then I'm complicit in it." They had reached the prince's study room, where Professor Whitmore would be waiting. Marcus placed a hand on George's shoulder. "Listen to me. You're in a difficult position, but you're asking the right questions. Don't make any decisions yet. Be careful about who you trust, including me. I'm going to look into this through my own channels, quietly. If there's something here, Dee will figure out the right way to handle it." George nodded, looking grateful for the support. "Thank you, Detective Sergeant. I know I'm putting you in an awkward position." "It's my job to protect you," Marcus said. "That includes protecting you from making choices you'll regret. Now go to your tutorial and try to act normal. Don't let Sir Edmund or anyone else know that you suspect they're on to you." As George entered the study room, Marcus pulled out his phone and sent a carefully worded text message to his supervisor, requesting a confidential meeting. Whatever was happening in the palace, it was bigger than a 16-year-old prince and a protection officer could handle alone. They needed help, and they needed to be very careful about where they sought it. The rest of the day passed with unusual tension. Marcus noticed increased activity among senior staff members, more hushed conversations in corners, and several people who normally didn't interact having long discussions behind closed doors. Sir Edmund seemed to be at the center of this activity, moving from office to office with unusual urgency. That evening, as Marcus prepared to end his shift, he received a message requesting his presence at a meeting the following morning with Sir Edmund and the head of palace security. The message was polite but firm, and Marcus knew it wasn't really a request. Someone wanted to know why he was asking questions, and they wanted to know quickly. He had less than 12 hours to decide how much to reveal and how much to keep hidden. The protection of Prince George, and possibly the monarchy itself, might depend on the choices he made in that meeting. As darkness fell over the palace grounds, Marcus stood at a window watching the lights come on across London. Somewhere in this building were documents that could potentially bring down some very powerful people. A teenage prince had stumbled onto something that others had kept hidden for decades. And now Marcus Webb, a career detective who had always played by the rules, found himself in the middle of a situation where the rules might not apply. He thought about his oath to protect the royal family and his duty to uphold the law. He thought about the young prince who had trusted him with a terrible burden. Most of all, he thought about what it meant to do the right thing when the right thing could have devastating consequences. Whatever happened next, Marcus knew his life was about to become very complicated. Marcus arrived at the palace 2 hours earlier than his scheduled meeting the next morning. The city was still dark, the streets quiet except for the occasional taxi and early morning delivery truck. He had spent most of the night thinking about how to approach the situation, and he had decided that honesty, at least partial honesty, was his best strategy. He would acknowledge his concern about Prince George's behavior while being careful not to reveal what the prince had actually discovered. It was a delicate line to walk. The head of palace security, Commander Patricia Thornberry, was a former military intelligence officer with a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless. She had been appointed to her position 3 years earlier after a security breach that had embarrassed the previous administration. Marcus respected her competence, but had always found her difficult to read. She revealed nothing in her expressions, and seemed to view every situation through a strategic lens. Sir Edmund was already in the conference room when Marcus arrived, sitting at the head of a polished mahogany table with several folders arranged neatly in front of him. Commander Thornberry sat to his right, her uniform immaculate as always. The room itself was windowless and soundproofed, used for sensitive discussions that couldn't risk being overheard. "Detective Sergeant Webb, thank you for joining us," Sir Edmund began, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Please sit down. We have some matters to discuss regarding your duties with Prince George." Marcus sat across from them, maintaining steady eye contact. "Of course, Sir Edmund. How can I help?" Commander Thornberry opened one of the folders. "Your protection logs show you've accompanied Prince George to the East Wing Library 14 times in the past 3 weeks. That's an unusually high frequency for that particular location. Can you explain the nature of these visits?" "The prince is conducting research for a history project," Marcus replied. "He's been examining historical documents related to palace administration. It's educational work approved by his tutors." "Yes, we're aware of the official purpose," Sir Edmund interjected. "What concerns us is the intensity of his interest and some questions he's been asking his instructors. Questions about financial oversight, legal accountability, and historical scandals involving the monarchy. Would these seem unusual topics for a 16-year-old school project?" Marcus kept his expression neutral. "Prince George is an intelligent young man with a curious mind. I don't think it's unusual for him to ask challenging questions." "Perhaps not," Commander Thornberry said, her gaze unwavering. "But combined with the specific documents he's been accessing and his reaction when Sir Edmund attempted to redirect his research yesterday, we have concerns about what he might have found and who he might share it with." The implication was clear. They knew George had discovered something, and they wanted to control the situation before it went further. Marcus chose his words carefully. "If there's something in those historical documents that's sensitive, perhaps it should be properly archived or restricted. And I'm not aware of any inappropriate behavior from Prince George." Sir Edmund leaned forward. "Marcus, may I be frank with you? You've been with the Protection Service for 8 years. You have an excellent record. You're trusted, which is why you were assigned to Prince George. We're bringing you into this conversation because we believe you understand the delicate nature of royal life and the importance of discretion." "I appreciate that," Marcus said, sensing what was coming next. "Every institution with a long history has complicated aspects," Sir Edmund continued. "The monarchy is no different. Sometimes decisions were made, arrangements established, that served important purposes at the time but might look questionable through a modern lens. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "I think so," Marcus replied, though he was careful not to agree with anything specific. Commander Thornberry took over. "Prince George is at an age where things appear very black and white. Right and wrong seem clear-cut. But those of us with more experience understand that reality is more complex, especially in matters of state and governance. If he's stumbled across historical records that concern him, the appropriate response is to provide context and guidance, not to encourage investigative behavior that could be damaging." "Are you asking me to discourage the prince from his research?" Marcus asked directly. "We're asking you to help him understand the bigger picture," Sir Edmund said, "and to inform us immediately if he shares specific concerns with you or attempts to remove documents from the library. We need to manage this situation appropriately." Marcus felt the trap closing. If he agreed too readily, they would know he was being dishonest. If he refused outright, they would remove him from George's detail and assign someone more compliant. He needed to buy time. "I understand the sensitivity of the situation. My primary concern is always Prince George's safety and well-being. If he's troubled by something he's found, that affects his mental state, which is part of my responsibility." "Exactly," Commander Thornberry said, "which is why we need your cooperation in handling this delicately. We're not asking you to betray the prince's trust, just to help guide him away from areas that could cause unnecessary distress or misunderstanding." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with Sir Edmund and Commander Thornberry carefully outlining what they expected from Marcus. They wanted reports on George's activities, advance notice of any unusual behavior, and immediate notification if the prince attempted to discuss his findings with anyone outside the palace, particularly journalists or legal authorities. In exchange, they assured Marcus that his career prospects would benefit from his sound judgment and loyalty during a challenging time. When the meeting finally ended, Marcus felt like he needed a shower. He had successfully avoided making any explicit promises while leaving them with the impression that he would cooperate. It was a temporary solution at best. Eventually, they would expect results, and his lack of useful information would raise suspicions. He found Prince George in the music room that afternoon, ostensibly practicing piano, but clearly distracted. When the prince saw Marcus, he immediately stopped playing. "How did it go?" Marcus glanced around to ensure they were alone, then closed the door. "They know you've found something. They don't know exactly what or how much you understand, but they're worried. They've asked me to report on your activities and discourage you from pursuing this further." George's face fell. "So you're supposed to spy on me?" "They think I will," Marcus corrected. "I haven't agreed to anything specific, but I can't refuse outright without losing access to you. If they replace me with someone who's actually working against you, you'll be in a worse position." The prince absorbed this, then nodded slowly. "That makes sense. So what do we do?" "First, you need to act like you've lost interest in the library. I spend time on normal teenage activities. Be visible doing ordinary things. If they think the problem is solving itself, they'll relax their vigilance. And second, we need to figure out exactly what you've found and what it means. I need to see those documents myself, not in the library where we can be observed, but copies. Did you photograph any pages?" George shook his head. "I was worried about being caught with images on my phone, but I made detailed notes." He pulled out his leather notebook. "Everything I found is documented here, including ledger references and page numbers." Marcus took the notebook, feeling the weight of it. "This is good work, George. Very thorough. I'm going to study this tonight and reach out to someone I trust, a former colleague who now works in financial crimes. And she might be able to help us understand what we're looking at." "Can you trust her?" George asked, worried. "With my life," Marcus assured him. "She's investigated corruption cases involving powerful people before. If anyone can look at this objectively and tell us whether it's legitimate or criminal, she can. But I need you to promise me something." "What?" "No matter what we discover, we handle this carefully and legally. No going to the press, no dramatic confrontations. If there's real wrongdoing here, we build a proper case and take it through appropriate channels. Can you agree to that?" George hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. I don't want to damage the monarchy if it can be avoided. But I also can't ignore evidence of corruption. That people trust us to be better than this." The idealism in the young prince's voice reminded Marcus why he had joined the protection service in the first place. For all the pageantry and politics, there was something noble in the idea of public service and institutional integrity. George understood that, perhaps better than many of the adults around him. Over the following week, George followed Marcus's advice and backed away from his library research. He attended his tutorials dutifully, spent time with friends, and even allowed himself to be photographed at a charity football match. To outside observers, whatever phase he had been going through seemed to have passed. Sir Edmund appeared satisfied, and the tension that had permeated the palace began to ease. Meanwhile, Marcus worked through George's notes every evening, cross-referencing dates and names, building a timeline of the mysterious payments. What emerged was a pattern that spanned 4 decades. The amounts varied, but the regularity suggested an organized system rather than random transactions. Some payments coincided with major political decisions affecting the crown, like changes in taxation laws or debates about public funding for royal activities. Others seemed connected to business deals involving properties or investments associated with the royal family. What troubled Marcus most were the payments to media figures, particularly those who had written favorably about the monarchy during scandals or difficult periods. It suggested a sophisticated influence operation, using royal funds to shape public perception. If true, that it would be a massive breach of the political neutrality the monarchy was supposed to maintain. He met his former colleague, Detective Inspector Sarah Chen, at a quiet pub in South London, far from anywhere they might encounter palace staff or royal reporters. Sarah had spent 15 years in financial crimes before moving to the Metropolitan Police's anti-corruption unit. She was one of the most skilled forensic accountants Marcus had ever worked with. "I hope you realize how irregular this is," Sarah said as she examined the notes Marcus had brought. "You're asking me to investigate possible crimes involving the royal household based on second-hand information from a teenage prince. This could end both our careers." "I know," Marcus admitted, "but if we don't look into it and something genuinely criminal is happening, we're complicit. I need to know if this is real before deciding what to do next." Sarah studied the notes for a long time, occasionally making marks with her pen or pulling up reference materials on her laptop. Finally, she sat back and let out a long breath. "Okay, here's what I can tell you without conducting a formal investigation. The pattern you're describing is consistent with what we call a slush fund, money set aside for payments that can't go through normal channels. Sometimes these are legitimate, used for security operations or sensitive diplomatic work. But the amounts you're describing are enormous, and the recipients seem questionable. Can you tell if it's illegal? Not without seeing the actual documents and understanding the source of the funds. If this money came from the sovereign grant or other public funding, then yes. This would be a serious misuse of taxpayer money. If it's from private royal income, it's murkier. Still potentially illegal depending on what the payments were for, but harder to prosecute. What about the media payments? Sarah's expression darkened. Those are the most problematic. If the royal household was paying journalists or media organizations for favorable coverage, that's not just unethical. It could violate laws about media manipulation and political interference. The monarchy is supposed to be above politics, but this would be active political manipulation. Marcus felt his stomach sink. So it's real. This isn't just old accounting irregularities or legitimate security expenses. Based on what you've shown me, there's enough to warrant a serious investigation. But Marcus, you need to understand what you're getting into. If this goes public, it will be the biggest royal scandal in decades. People will lose their jobs, reputations will be destroyed, and the monarchy itself could be seriously damaged. Are you prepared for that? I don't know, Marcus said honestly. But a 16-year-old kid stumbled onto this and asked for help. I can't just ignore it. Then you need to make a choice, Sarah said. Either you take this to the proper authorities and start a formal investigation, or you bury it and hope no one else ever finds it. There's no middle ground here. Marcus thought about Prince George, burdened with knowledge that no teenager should have to carry. He thought about all the palace staff who had probably known about this for years and said nothing. He thought about his oath to uphold the law and his duty to protect the royal family. What if there was a way to handle this that didn't become a public scandal? He asked. What if we could get the people responsible to stop and make restitution without dragging everything into the open? Sarah considered this. You mean like a quiet internal investigation with voluntary cooperation? That only works if the people involved are willing to admit wrongdoing and accept consequences. From what you've described, these are powerful individuals who've been operating this system for decades. They're not going to go quietly. But if we had leverage, evidence that could expose them, might they be willing to negotiate a resolution? Maybe, Sarah admitted. But you'd need to be very careful. People with this much to lose can be dangerous. They might try to discredit you, destroy evidence, or worse. Worse how? Sarah met his eyes. I've worked corruption cases before. When powerful people feel threatened, they sometimes resort to extreme measures. I'm not trying to scare you, but you should know what you're potentially facing. Marcus absorbed this sobering warning. He thought about George's safety, his own career, and the broader implications of whatever came next. But he also thought about the principle at stake. If the royal family was involved in corruption, shouldn't that matter? Shouldn't someone hold them accountable, even if it was difficult and dangerous? I need to think about this, he told Sarah. Can you sit on this information for a while without reporting it? Officially, I should report suspicious activity immediately. Unofficially, I haven't seen any concrete evidence yet, just your notes and theories. So yes, I can give you some time. But not forever, Marcus. If there's real corruption here, it needs to be addressed. I understand. Thank you for meeting with me. As Marcus drove back to his flat that night, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief but chilling. Stop asking questions. This is your only warning. Someone was watching him more closely than he had realized. The investigation he had hoped to conduct quietly was already compromised. Marcus had to make decisions quickly now, before whoever sent that message decided warnings weren't enough.